So good morning, everyone. So good to be with you this morning. Um, Scrolling through the list of participants, I see many familiar faces and names, and particularly in times like this, it's just so good to be able to spend this time together. Hopefully, you all can hear me okay. Welcome to my home. As I'm sure is the case with most people on this call, that's probably where we're all joining this from. Um, I will say up front that feels a little bit shallow to be talking about rankings during a time like this, but at the same time, I'm really heartened as I reflect and really thankful to be affiliated with such a great place as Northwestern and Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and just really feel blessed to be able to interact every day with such great colleagues and staff and faculty and students and alumni, and be able to see the just terrific things that our alumni and others in our community do on a day in day out basis to make this place a better world, and that's really a blessing. And also just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for all you do for the school and all that you do financially for the school, and your generosity, because your gifts are really what allow us to have the resources and the wherewithal to be able to do the things that we need to do to make sure that we keep Northwestern strong and great, and among the really the top institutions in the world. And so thank you so much for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about rankings today, and I'll just start off with a little bit of a introduction in terms of how we view rankings. They're kind of a blessing and a curse, I guess, overall, and depending on if you go up or down. But one thing I will say is that no matter if you go up one slot or down one slot, it's always been very clear that Northwestern is considered one of the elite and one of the great. So that's something I think to keep in perspective for everyone. The rankings are one source of consumer information. It is something that many important constituents rely on. Our applicants take them very seriously when they're making their decisions. Employers refer to them as they're making decisions about their hiring at different schools. I'm sure that alumni take it into consideration, and it has an impact on their affinity for the school as well. And so they are important, but I think they have to be approached with a certain amount of caution, because there are pitfalls in them, and we'll talk about some of those as well. So there's good and bad inherent, and I think we all just need to kind of keep them in perspective as we consider them. I thought I would start off first by talking about the fact that there are other rankings besides U.S. News and World Report. There are a number of them, many of them which occur every year. Some you may be familiar with and some not. So first of all, the National Law Journal does a ranking annually, about a month earlier than where we are right now. So typically in about February every year. And it's based on the percent of graduates employed in the most recent class who were employed by the NLJ 100 firms, or the top law firms in the country. And this current year, just a month ago, those rankings came out and we were number 4. These rankings go back to about 2007. And every single year we've been in the top 10, except for one, I think, where we were number 11. And in many years we've been in the top 5. So that's something that this is one particular ranking that we traditionally do extremely well in. Above the Law, that website that I'm sure we're all very familiar with. They do an annual ranking now. They started doing this in 2013, and their ranking is based entirely on outputs, primarily employment results, cost and debt data, and they also do some surveys with alumni as well. And most recently, when these came out, I believe it was in June last year, we came out number 4, so we did extremely well in that particular ranking as well. The Princeton Review, they also have an annual ranking where they rank you on a number of different factors. The one that we have always tended to really hone in on is the best career prospects ranking, which is based on a combination of surveys among current students as well as your actual employment results. And most recently, when these came out this past fall, we came in at number 6. This is another ranking where we've traditionally done very well from year to year. You'll also see that this last year we were ranked number 7 for the best classroom experience, number 9 for the toughest to get into, and number 10 for the best law school professors. These next two, Vault and Forbes, they're a little bit more sporadic. So they've come out with some rankings in various years, unpredictably. The most recent with Vault was back in February 2017, where they also did an employment ranking, and this was based on the percentage and number of associates in law firms with 150 more attorneys. We came out number 10 in terms of the overall number, but number 2 in terms of the percentage representation in those firms. And then finally, Forbes has done some rankings throughout the years based on salary information of alumni. They've gotten their information from PayScale. And our most recent rank was number 3 in 2014. That particular ranking was based on the law schools whose grads make the highest starting salaries. They did one a couple of years earlier based on mid-career salaries, and I think we had come out number 11 on that particular one. I think that was in 2012 or 13. And then finally, the one that I think we all tend to be familiar with and focus on the most, and that's U.S. News and World Report. And I talked a little bit earlier in terms of how closely that tends to be watched by many constituents. That comes out annually in March. And as hopefully by now you've all heard, we came in at tie for 9 when these were released just a week ago today. We were tied with the University of Michigan and Berkeley. So now we're going to get into a little bit more detail on what's behind the U.S. News rankings. So this particular slide shows you all of the different factors and weights that they apply to the ranking. So the first 2 are assessment scores that they do with peer academics and lawyers and judge practitioners. And for the peer assessment score, they send a survey to the law school deans, to the faculty chair of the appointments committee, to the person who's in charge of your dean in charge of curriculum, and to the most recently tenured professor. And the survey is a simple list of all 200 or so ABA approved law schools, and you're asked to rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being marginal and 5 being distinctive or outstanding. And you can also just answer, I don't know. And that has no impact, positive or negative, on the results. So typically about 2/3 of the respondents or the people surveyed actually end up responding. So there's a pretty high response rate on that. The second one, up until 2 years ago, this used to be mailed to law firm hiring partners and judges throughout the country. But 2 years ago, well, I should say actually about 5 years ago, in 2014, they began asking law schools to provide them with a list of 10 individuals that they would like to be surveyed for this. So for a number of years, it was a combination of the hiring partners and judges plus the lists that the law schools provide. But 2 years ago, they actually shifted so that it's only they're only surveying the individuals who were on the lists that the schools submitted. And so the response rates have changed since they asked the schools to provide those lists. It used to be about 33% who responded, and now it's about 2/3 who respond. So the response rate now is pretty similar to the academics and the peers. So those 2 carry the most weight in the rankings, 25% for the academics and 15% for the practitioners. And then you have a whole bunch of other factors like employment information, rates at graduation, rates 10 months after graduation, your median LSAT scores, your median undergraduate GPAs, student faculty ratio, bar passage information, volumes in the library, which is very interesting and curious, I guess, these days. And then also expenditures per student. So they're tracking what you're spending on faculty and staff salaries, on library supporting services, operational expenses, those kinds of things. And I point that out because even though it's just 9.75% of the weight, once you apply the formula, the expenditures actually carry significantly higher weight than that and influence in the final rankings that come out. And that's because what they do is they calculate what's called a z-score for all of the values and all the ranking inputs, which is it's your value minus the average of all of the values in the population divided by the standard deviation. So for those categories where the standard deviation in the denominator is small relative to the numerator, once you multiply that times the weight amount, the significance actually goes up substantially, and that's what tends to happen with the expenditures per student. Likewise, in the admissions side, on the admissions side of things, the median GPA actually ends up carrying more weight in the ranking than the median LSAT score. One thing I should point out is that if you have questions along the way, you can either use the chat feature on here to send in your question, or you can raise your hand. And I know we have people here who are helping out from Alumni Relations and Development who are going to be managing that and helping us out with the questions that come in. So these were the results this year for the top 14 law schools. And as you can see, first of all, the order of the schools is exactly the same as it was the previous year. The only difference is that there was some breaking of ties. So for example, Columbia went from 5th into a tie for 4th with the University of Chicago. Berkeley and us moved up a slot from a tie for 10th the previous year to a tie for 9th. And then Duke, who was tied for 10th last year, broke out of that tie and shifted down to 12th. This slide here actually shows you our particular values in each of the different categories this year versus last year. So and then finally in the last two columns, it shows you the difference in our ranks in each of those 2 years. So you see that we improved in 2020 in about 6 different categories. The ones that were really significant were the employment at 10 months after graduation, which as you go to the right, you'll see that we were ranked 9th in that category in 2019. We were ranked 2nd. We had the 2nd highest employment rate in 2020. And that particular factor from the prior slide, you'll see that that's got one of the heavier weights on the scale. We also improved on the undergraduate GPA, which I had mentioned previously has an impact. And interestingly enough, if you scroll all the way down to the bar passage rate, want to spend a brief minute talking about this. So our ranking went, you'll see it went from 46th to 15th. So what's that all about? So historically, well, let me back up. So with the bar passage rate, it's actually based on a ratio, which is your bar passage rate divided by the overall state pass rate where most of your graduates take the bar exam. And so historically, Illinois is at a high overall state passage rate relative to others. And so we were really hindered by this because for example, in 2019, if we would have had a 100% pass rate, the highest we could have placed was 27th. And I know in years past, the highest we could have placed actually in some cases was somewhere in the 30s or even close to 40th. And so we and the University of Chicago and other Illinois schools were significantly disadvantaged here. Well, this past year, what actually happened was the Illinois pass rate went down. And as many of you know, there was, I think, a lowering or a hiring of the required pass score in Illinois a few years ago. And so what's happened is this last year, the pass rate in Illinois was 76%. New York, which was previously advantaged, their pass rate it went up from 76% to 81%. So that really assisted us this last year in that we were actually able to move up to 15th. The California schools in particular really benefit because the California pass rate is typically down in the 60s somewhere. US News also does rankings in a number of different subject specialty areas. Those are all listed here. The ones all the way down until you get to business corporate law have been ranked for many, many years. The business corporate contracts, commercial law, criminal law, and constitutional law were new rankings this year. And I just wanted to highlight three of these in particular, which I think we're really, really, well, we're excited about. So the first is that our clinical training, our Bloom Legal Clinic, was actually ranked 6th this year, up from 13th a year ago. And that's actually the highest it's been ranked since 2004. In 2004, it was 5th. So we're really happy to see the movement there. These rankings are actually based upon the same kind of a peer assessment survey that I talked about with the peer assessment rankings for the overall rankings. So in other words, they send these to all of the, I'm sorry, each of the schools designates a person in the specialty area at their law school that they would like the survey to be sent to. And then those individuals rank every law school in that specialty area on that 1 to 5 scale. And so that's how these are compiled. Dispute resolution also improved significantly to 6th from 10th in 2019, and that's actually the highest we've ever been ranked, going all the way back to the beginning. Previously, our high was number 7 in 1999. And then finally, tax law. We started our tax program back in 2002, and every year up until the present, we have been ranked number 4. So it was fantastic to see us actually nudge up a slot after all these years, and they were tied for number 3 this year. So really, really happy about that.
Hi, Don. We have a question on the previous slide.
Sure.
Where Pete Wentz asks, where do the
What,
GRE?
Pete?
Oh, there. Go ahead, Pete. Oh, okay. Pete asked, where do GRE scores factor into LSAT median?
You know, that's a really terrific question. So what we are told is that where you have GRE, so the LSAT ranking is actually based on the percentile, not the score. And what US News says they do is that they do a weighted average based on the percentage of your students who take the LSAT and the median percentile associated with that, with the percentage, with the percentile of the GRE on the weighted percentage of the number that are entering with the GRE. And so the problem with that is that the GRE doesn't have a composite score like the LSAT. There's a separate percentile and score for the verbal, for the quantitative, and for an analytical writing assessment. And we've inquired with them as to how they account for that, and they're very tight-lipped on that. So unfortunately, we don't know exactly how they take that into consideration. We do know that at the undergraduate level, with the university rankings, for those schools that are either SAT or ACT optional, what they do there is if at least 25% of your students enrolled without either the SAT or the ACT, they actually dock your score by a full point. But we don't have any kind of an indication with the law school rankings that they do something similarly, and none of us are even close to hitting that sort of a threshold. So it's a good question. We don't know the exact answer. All we know is in a general sense that they do some sort of a weighted average between them. Okay, so this is how our Northwestern professional schools did this year. You can see that Kellogg jumped up to a tie for 3rd. They were previously tied for 6th in 2019. Feinberg moved up a notch to 18th from 19th the year before, and McCormick moved up to 19th from 20th the year before. And then our School of Law, our Education and Social Policy, also improved to 7th this year from 10th the previous year. I didn't have them on this slide. So all in all, it was a really good showing this year for Northwestern. Okay, so what I did here have to take a second to describe what's going on here. So we're actually at the 30th anniversary of the US News rankings this year. They've been around since 1991. And so what I did is I looked at 5-year periods all the way through. So I looked at the average rank of all the top 14 law schools during the first 5 years of the rankings, the second 5 years of the rankings, and so on, all the way up to the most recent 5 years of the rankings. And tried to identify those schools who have, I guess, demonstrated a sustained improvement in their rank. And these are those schools here. And so this is kind of opposite, because the higher the number, the worse your rank is. So you got to kind of look at this as the line going down is good, and a line going up is not so good. That would be a decline in your ranking. So um, Northwestern, in our case, our average ranking in the first 5 years was 12.6. Our average ranking in the most recent years was 10 point. I can't see it because I got the faces on the right, but it's 10.4, I think is what it says. You can see the same then with the changes with Berkeley, Penn, and Stanford. The interesting thing about Berkeley is that you can see that while their ranking is lower now than it was at the beginning, it's actually in recent years been moving in the wrong direction. And so the biggest improvements over the period of time have been with us and with the University of Pennsylvania. As far as the schools that have had declines, looking at it in that exact same way, there are 3 schools. Georgetown, which has gone from an average of 11.6 to now 14.2. I should mention that the reason we focus on the top 14 law schools is because with the exception of 1 year, the top 14 law schools have been the same every single year since the rankings began. And Georgetown dipped to 15th, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, and that's why it's 14.2. Duke has declined from an average of 8.4 to 10.8, and Michigan has declined from an average of 7 to 8.4. So I have 2 more slides, and these talk specifically about the peer assessments and the practitioner assessments, with the first point that I'll make being that both of them are very, very sticky. There's, I think, sort of an echo chamber effect that goes on with them. So the first point I'll make is that the top 14 law schools, if you collectively compute their average every single year since the beginning, it's remained exactly the same at 4.5 collectively across all of the top 14 law schools. However, they tend to get a little bit tougher over time for individual schools. So when you compare the average assessment score for the first 5 years and the most recent 5 years, like I did on that previous slide, every top 14 law school has either declined or stayed the same. No one has gone up from the beginning to the end. Having said that, there are some schools that have made some leaps in terms of the rank relative to the other schools. So even though the scores haven't gone up, while others have gone down and they've remained the same, it's had an impact on their overall ranking. And so in particular, NYU has jumped up roughly 2.4 ranking points over the time, and Georgetown has actually improved by 2. On the other hand, if you look at the declines that have occurred, Chicago has gone down by 3.2 points from at the beginning being tied for number 1 in the peer assessment to now an average of 4.2, and Michigan has gone down 5 slots from an average of 2.4 during those first 5 years to 7.4 during the most recent 5 years. And then turning to the practitioner assessments, the same kind of information here in that you can say the same over the first 5 years versus the last 5 years, and that everyone's score has either stayed the same or gone down. Interestingly, except for Northwestern, we've actually gone up by 0.1. One difference here is that up until 1998, US News did not actually provide the actual scores on the practitioner assessment for each school. They only provided the rank. So it's a little bit different here in that I'm comparing the 1995 5-year period versus the most recent 5-year period, whereas with the academic assessments, we were going back all the way to 1991. And again, if you look at the top 14's collective average during the entire period, it's remained at 4.5, just like the academics. Significant ranking improvements over the period of time. Again, NYU is showing up. We saw them show up on the academic assessments as well. Berkeley has gone up, and Stanford and Columbia have gone up. Looking at the declines, again, Michigan, it's gone down an average of 3.2 slots over time, and Georgetown has gone down an average of 3.4 slots. So I think that's everything that I wanted to go over right now, and I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you have.
Okay, we did have a couple of questions come in from Steve. He asks, what do we know about the number of deans who are alums? If I recall, it is very low.
Yeah, it is. I think that's right. I'm aware of, I think maybe 2 or 3. I know, for example, that one of our alums is the dean at Notre Dame Law School right now. And I believe there may be a couple more as well.
Next question from Tim Durst. He asks, can you please explain why everyone talks about the top 14 law schools? Always seemed like an oddity to me.
Yeah, this goes back to the fact that since the U.S. News rankings began in 1991, the top 14 have been exactly the same list of schools every single year, except for, as I mentioned, I think in 2015 or so, when Georgetown flipped to 15 and Texas shifted up for 1 year to 14.
And Paul asks, any color on Kellogg's jump?
Any color on Kellogg's jump? That's an interesting question. I can't say for sure. I don't know the ins and outs. I believe that as you look at their results, all the different categories, their employment results were really strong this year, both in terms of starting salaries and their employment rates. I think with the business schools, it's at graduation and 6 months after graduation. Their meet, actually it's average GMAT in the case of the business schools, also was right up there, I think, in the top 4. And I should make a point here that we know that in recent years, Kellogg has done quite a bit of analytics in terms of the U.S. News rankings, and in this past year, we have as well. And I want to actually give some credit here to a committee that we have. It's a U.S. News committee that's comprised of Melissa Kaiser, who's our Associate Dean of Marketing, Jim Speta, who's Vice Dean, David Schwartz, who is our Associate Dean of Faculty, Amy Post, who is our Executive Director of Finance, and I'm on this committee as well. And so we've actually spent a lot of time analyzing the rankings, and we've actually really been able to kind of create and replicate the model, and so that it's really informative in terms of helping you to determine what may be causing individual shifts from year to year. Now, it's not perfect because you don't know the results ahead of time for the 2 big assessments with the practitioners and the academics. You only know the information, the objective information that is published prior to that point, which is your employment rates and your admissions result, and I believe bar passage information as well. But so I think Kellogg also has been informed in terms of what maybe they can do internally in a meaningful way, and so I would imagine that there could have been some strategy involved as well behind the analytics.
Paul asked a follow-up. Do you know who was 1 and 2 for MBA?
Yeah, this year I think it was a tie for first with Harvard and Stanford.
Okay.
And we were tied with Kellogg was tied with the University of Chicago. I'm sorry, I had a little slip there because I went to Kellogg as well. So I got a little bit of a we there too.
All right, Pete has another question. Do we and presumably others encourage the practitioners we name to make sure they vote? And is it the same every year?
Um, yes, we do. In fact, a number of the people on the call here are among the group that we have been soliciting. And as they know, many of them actually are you know, so responsive and do this, but they're also very busy. And so, as they know, I do tend to follow up and make sure that they're filling it out and get confirmation that that's happened. You know, we don't provide them by design. We don't provide them with, you know, specific guidance on how to vote or anything like that. We're not trying to game the system that way.
Amy, we have the Savvy Amy posts on our webinar here, and
Hi,
she
Amy.
wanted to clarify that it's Penn and Stanford for the MBA. Harvard is number 6, apparently.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate that.
Steve had a question, not rankings related, but could you please give us a brief update on how enrollment is going?
So right now, enrollment on the JD side looks very good. We actually, applications at the end of the day, I think we were down about 3% from last year, which is similar to what's happening nationally. But you'll remember that you may recall that that's on the after 2 record years, and so the quality of the pool was actually stronger this year than it was last year at the high end. And we have gone out with most of our offers of admission at this point. The candidates have until April 30th to make their decisions. They typically wait until sometime around the second week of April or so before they actually start sending in their deposits. So we don't have any of that information yet, but the quality of the pool looks really strong. You know, the one area that we're all monitoring really closely is our international LLM program, and what's evolving on that side, and with the visa processes, and of course hoping that this whole situation and the health considerations resolve themselves before the fall. So we've been having a lot of internal discussions and planning for contingencies regarding our international students.
That was it for the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining. It's been really great, again, as I said at the beginning, to be able to have this time together. I certainly hope you all are safe and healthy, and your families are, and loved ones. And you know, again, take heart that we're all part of this great community. We're all here to help each other and support each other through this. And we're going to get through it and be stronger on the other side, I'm sure, for having this experience. So thank you all so much, and hope you all have great rest of the day.